Sabbath study, my spirit upon flesh. You will find this in Joel, Yah is power, chapter 2, verse 28. Yah is power, chapter 2, verse 28. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. And this is true. This is true. Joel describes the Most High's power, and this is the power of his spirit. It can bring out the truth, which is what this video is about. Who has the right to return back to the promised land?
This whole issue of Israel and Palestine is covered in so much myth, and there's so much double standard when people talk about this issue. And I'll give you two examples. I don't know if you heard Bibi Netanyahu's speech at the United Nations. I heard it not live, but after he actually delivered it, and he began it with probably the two most striking examples of myth and double standard. And he began by talking about the right of return of the Jews to their ancient homeland. And of course, the Jews that returned, so-called returned to their homeland, were not exactly the same Jews who were expelled from their homeland, right? Because these were expelled a couple of thousand years before that. These were not their descendants either, because this has been a very long time. So these are people, the people that actually came back, so to speak, are people that claim some kind of a heritage, some kind of a connection, a relationship to the ancient Hebrews. And they claimed that they had the right to return to their homeland, and this is what Zionism was about, and this was accepted by the world as the right. They had the right to return. Now, if we talk about the right of return of one nation, you'd expect that there would be, if we accept it as a principle, then you'd expect that we'd accept it in general, across the board. Yet when people talk about the right of return of Palestinians to their homeland, suddenly a red line comes up and everybody says, no, we can't talk about the right of return of the Palestinians. This has to be taken off the table. This is not negotiable. The right of return of the Palestinians is not acceptable. What's interesting about that is that the right of return of the Palestinians, quite often we talk about the actual people who had to leave their homes. And if they had already passed away, then we're talking about their direct descendants. People who still have the keys and the deeds to their homes, and quite often can go to the very spot where a village existed, where today there might be a highway, and will point out the mosque, and will point out the well, and will point out the door to their home. Yet they do not enjoy the right to return. So obviously, this is a double standard of immense proportions.
1947, United Nations. You need to know this date.
A good place to start, if we're going to talk about how this conflict began, a good place to start would be on the 29th of November, 1947. The day that United Nations accepted the resolution to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And this ridiculous map is what they came up with. Now, when you look at this map, before you even hear about the details, before we even touch on the details of this map, just by looking at it, it's unbelievable that anybody expected that this would work.
Conquer and destroy over 80% of the land.
Yet when the United Nations came up with this ridiculous plan, they chose to give the larger portion of the country to the smaller community, to the Jewish community. And the smaller portion of the land to the larger community. And then people said, and to this day you hear people say, see, the Arabs, the Palestinians, did not accept the partition plan, so all this is their fault. Is anybody mad enough to think that they would accept this? Would anybody in their place have accepted something like this? Obviously not. And obviously, like I said, this did not last even a single day. Because as soon as the resolution was accepted, the Zionist forces, what was called the Haganah, the Palmach, began a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing. Now the story that we hear, the myth that we're told about 1947, and I heard it once again today, earlier today, at the Seattle Times, is that in 1947, after the United Nations finally recognized the right of the Jewish people to have their own state, the Arab armies attacked, intending to destroy this fledgling state, this young Jewish community. And this is only several years after the Nazi Holocaust. Yet somehow, between the end of 1947 and the end of 1948, the Zionist forces were able to conquer almost 80% of the country, destroy over 500 towns and villages, including schools and mosques and churches and homes, and exile almost 1 million people within a 12-month period.
1947 equals force of military power.
How did they do this if they were being attacked by massive armies from the outside? But once again, when we look at the facts, we realize that in 1947, the Jewish community, the Zionist community, had quite a substantial military force. They had a force of close to 40,000 armed men. And well trained, well indoctrinated. My father was one of them. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. The Palestinians have never had a military force. To this day, the Palestinians have never had an army or a military force. There was no equivalent of the other side. The Arab armies, such as they were, didn't enter the war until late in May of 1948. Much of the ethnic cleansing had already taken place. The war had been taking place for over 6 months by then. So, of course, this is a myth. This is a myth that nobody takes the time to investigate and question. But once again, the reality that in a 12-month period, so much was done exactly because that is exactly was the purpose of these Zionist forces.
Who has the objective?
To capture as much of the land as possible and get rid of as many people as possible.
Israeli militia versus Israeli government. Who's going to win?
Now, just kind of to touch on the history, some of you I'm sure recall, the Egyptian President Nasser decided to kick out the UN peacekeeping forces that were in the Sinai Peninsula that divided Egypt from Israel. And he entered against the ceasefire agreement that existed between the countries. He entered Egyptian troops into the Sinai Peninsula. The generals saw this as a cause for war, as a legitimate cause for war. And they pushed for war. The Israeli cabinet, however, was not, they were hesitant. They were not so eager to start a war. And this tug of war began between these two groups. It was a very interesting difference between these two groups because the cabinet members were older. They were in their late 60s, early 70s, most of them. They were born in exile. They came with this whole baggage of exile, of pogroms. And, this is only 25 years after the Holocaust. And they carried all this. And they were worried that a war might lead to another Holocaust. The generals, however, were in their early 40s. Almost all of them were born in Palestine. Almost all of them were members of the Zionist militia in 1948. And they were what I like to call the new Jew that the Zionists wanted to create. Full of testosterone and very assertive and willing and ready to fight. And they created the Israeli army. Well, they wanted to fight. They saw an opportunity to start another war. Now, the myth that we're told about this, or the story I should say that we're told about the 1967 war, is that once again Israel was attacked by 3 massive armies intending to destroy it. And once again, miraculously, somehow, we, the Israelis, prevailed. because we're smarter and because we're better trained and we're more motivated, and as we heard now recently, we're somehow culturally superior as well, perhaps. Who knows? But all of these reasons, for all these reasons, we prevailed and we defeated the Arab armies.
Opportunity for war.
That the Egyptian army is not prepared for war, and therefore we must attack now. In fact, they said the Egyptian army needs at least 1.5 to 2 years before it will be prepared for war. So we have a tremendous opportunity now to once again, this will be the third time, to destroy the Egyptian army. And the fact that the Egyptian army brought their troops into Sinai and closer to us, closer to Israel, only makes it easier for us to destroy them. Not only are they not talking about an existential threat, they're not talking about any threat. They're talking about an opportunity, a military opportunity to once again defeat the Egyptian army. So once again, the myth fizzles away. The generals, of course, won the day. The government gave them the okay to start a preemptive strike against Egypt. The Egyptian army was decimated in a couple of days. The Sinai Peninsula was conquered once again. The Gaza Strip was conquered. And the generals wanted more. The generals wanted more. They wanted the West Bank, which was a sore spot for them because in 1948 they wanted to take it. They were young commanders in 1948, and they wanted the West Bank then. But for political reasons, Israel decided not to take it. Well, here was their opportunity, and they took the West Bank. And they'd wanted the Golan Heights for a long time too, because it's high up above the Galilee, and there's lots of water there, and they took that as well. And there was a lot of ambition too. The generals, the northern commander wanted the Golan Heights, the central commander wanted, they all wanted the laurels of victory. They had no doubt that they were going to be victorious. In 6 days, the Israeli army defeated and destroyed 3 Arab armies, conquered the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, killed over 15,000 Arab soldiers at a loss of 700 soldiers to the Israeli army. 15,000 to 700, that's quite a ratio. And all this was done in 6 days as Arab armies were attacking them.
What is the name of the game?
Palestine was erased completely from the map, and Israel was in completely over the entire map. This was the objective, this was the name of the game. Erasing Palestine, getting rid of the people, and de-Arabizing the country. De-Arabizing the country is what was left to do. That's why when people talk about the possibility of Israel somehow giving up the West Bank for a Palestinian state, if it wasn't so sad, it would be funny. It shows a complete misunderstanding of the objective of Zionism and the Jewish state, and the Zionist state. Because conquering the land was the first objective, getting rid of the people, and then de-Arabizing. And when I say de-Arabizing the country, this country has a 1,500-year-old history of Arab and Muslim rule. It was an Arab and a Muslim country more than it was anything else in history. So that has to be destroyed. Monuments have to be destroyed. Names have to be changed. The history has to be rewritten to connect once again King David to today's Israel.
Negotiate when?
Only in 1993, did the Israeli government agree to finally begin negotiating with the Palestinians. What happened? What changed? Well, what changed was they accomplished their mission of making the conquest of the West Bank irreversible. By 1993, the Israeli government knew for certain that a Palestinian state could not be established in the West Bank. The settlements were there, billions were invested. The entire Jordan River Valley was settled with villages and kibbutzim and things like that. There were major cities already built in the West Bank. Entire East Jerusalem was taken over by Israel. There was no place anymore for a Palestinian state to be established. And that is when Israel said, okay, we will begin negotiations. So they allowed Arafat to come, misleading him into thinking that they were really intending to make peace, and basically trying to force him to sign an agreement that would complete his surrender.
Who has been willing through all of this?
But the myth that we're always told is that the Palestinians are not willing to make concessions. And that is the problem. I think Mitt Romney just alluded to this as well in that little secret tape that was recorded. The problem is the Palestinians. They just don't want peace. Yasser Arafat was willing to give up almost 80% of his homeland and the right of the Palestinian refugees to return to their homeland and be compensated, all for the sake of peace. What he wouldn't do is he wouldn't go beyond, he wouldn't go, less than 20%. He wouldn't give up the West Bank and the Gaza. That he couldn't do. They want him to give up even more. They want him to sign a surrender agreement, and he wouldn't. It's not the Palestinians that aren't willing to make concessions. It's Israel that's incapable of making concessions, because concessions on the land are impossible from a Zionist perspective. The whole name of the game is taking the land and making it ours. And this is exactly the process that took place. Please.
What is this deep desire?
The wall has nothing to do with security. The massive armed Israeli forces along the road have nothing to do with security. The terrorizing and harassment that Palestinian Israelis go through when they go through Tel Aviv airport, the humiliating process that they have to go through, they have to endure every time they decide to leave and go overseas, has nothing to do with security. It has everything to do with racism, with hatred, and with a deep desire to keep us apart, to keep me privileged and them with no rights. That's the name of the game. That's what it's all about. And that's the purpose of the sign. Can you hit the next one, please?
Military of oppression.
I, on the other hand, served in the Israeli army, an army of occupation, an army of oppression, an army whose sole purpose is to make sure that he does not have a state, he does not have rights, and he dare not resist. So yes, my army has uniforms and commanders and generals, but which one of us is really the terrorist?
One state, 3 separate laws?
And Israel governs this one state very skillfully with 3 different sets of laws. You have the laws that govern people like myself, Israeli Jews, who can come and go and say what they please. Pretty much a democratic state for all purposes. You've got the laws that govern the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, and there are over 30 laws in the law books that discriminate against them specifically, and you've got an entire culture of discrimination against them that is deep-seated and deep-rooted in Israeli society. And then you've got the laws that govern the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and this is really at the pleasure of the Israeli army. If they want to destroy, they destroy. If they want to arrest and beat, they arrest and beat. If they want to torture, they torture. If they want to kill, they kill. And Palestinians have no recourse. This is the reality. There's an education system, the Zionist education system. Like Judith alluded, my sister just wrote a book about it. She's an educator that teaches racism in a very subtle way.
Best terrorist organization.
And then you've got the Israeli army, which I like to refer to as one of the best trained, best equipped, best fed terrorist organizations in the world. And yes, they have generals and they have nice uniforms, but their entire purpose is terrorism.
Who dropped 100 tons of bombs.
September the 27th, 2008, at 11:25 in the morning. What I refer to as the most shameful day in the Jewish history. The most shameful day in the history of the Jewish people. Israel began carpet bombing Gaza, and on the first day of what was to be a 21-day attack, they dropped 100 tons of bombs. Okay, a 1-ton bomb will decimate an entire city block. Gaza is one of the most densely populated places in the world. 800,000 children live in Gaza. 11:25 is exactly the time when the morning school shift and the afternoon school shift change. So all the kids are in the streets. All the children are on the streets. That was the moment decided by the decision makers in Israel to begin the attack. This was the first day of a 21-day slaughter that had absolutely no justification. If that's not terrorism, I don't know what is.
Who are descendants of Arab Jews?
I just heard this thing today about the vast differences between Israelis and Palestinians, cultural differences, the cultural superiority of the Israelis. I've never heard such nonsense in my life. The two societies could not be more similar. Their languages are similar. Their religions are similar. More than half Israelis, more than half of all Israelis are descendants of people who came from the Middle East. They're descendants of Arab Jews who came from Iraq, who came from North Africa, who came from Yemen. Arab culture is part of who they are. When Baghdad was being bombed, you had old Arab Jews from Baghdad in Israel crying that their city is being bombed.
Privileges?
There will be opposition, of course, on the Israeli side, because when you're privileged, you don't want to give up your privileges. You know, we, the Israeli Jews, are privileged in this society. And the privileges that are given to us by the state are part of the attempt to set us apart from the Palestinians. So if I break the law in Hebron, and a Palestinian breaks the exact same law in the exact same spot, the laws that govern the state of Israel, which are, regular, conventional law, applies to me. Israeli military law applies to the Palestinian. If I participate, or I should say when I participate in protests in the West Bank and I get arrested, everybody knows how it's going to end. I go home at the end of the day. I might get roughed up a little bit, whatever, but at the end of the day, everybody knows I go home. Because I'm an Israeli Jew. Palestinian that gets arrested will be beaten, will be tortured, and will be kept in prison as long as the local commander wants him in prison. It could be a day, it could be a week, it could be a month, it could be a year, without charges and without a trial. And then 6 months later, I get a letter from the police saying that the case was closed because of something, some technicality. So Israelis are not going to want to give up this privilege, but I think whites in South Africa didn't want to give up their privilege, and whites in America didn't want to give up their privilege either, but they're going to have to.
What does my messenger have to say? My spirit upon flesh, Mal-Akhi, my messenger. Mal-Akhi, chapter 3, verse 18. Then shall ye return, and discern between the righteous and the wicked, between him that serveth Yah and him that serveth him not. So when you get the Spirit, the Most High Spirit, that Holy Spirit, you're going to tell the truth, you're going to know the truth, and you're going to discern between the truth and lies.